Today let us talk about whether you should be dual booting Linux or not. Personally, I prefer not dual booting at all with Windows, for example. And the reason is not just one reason, I'll give you few reasons. First of all, it is a bit complex. Let us say you have a laptop with Windows 10 installed. Windows 10 is not really a bad OS. In fact, you might need Windows for doing your work. Now, when you install Linux by dual booting it, you have to create a separate partition, and it can be a bit complex, especially if you have never done it before. If you want to keep Windows but still learn Linux, then you can still do it. Nowadays, it is possible to have a Linux terminal, or in fact the whole Linux installed within Windows. So I made a video on this particular topic, I think a couple of months back. So that is always a possibility. Second reason is, if you are trying to, let us say, learn Linux, you might be thinking, okay, I'll install it on a laptop by dual booting it, and I will only use it for learning purpose. In my opinion, that never really works. Linux is a completely different operating system if you compare it with Windows. If you have been using Windows for many years, you cannot learn Linux properly unless you give Linux your full attention. So, in my opinion, I think if you are serious about learning Linux, which I think you should be, especially this is especially true if you are into IT. Let us say you want to become a programmer, or maybe you have ambitions to get a job as a developer. Linux is a must have skill. You need to have Linux skills, and you can learn Linux very quickly, efficiently, and you will learn a lot of things when you use Linux as your main operating system. I have been using Linux for all my working life ever since I started working on laptops. At least in the past 20 years, I have been using Linux and only Linux. Of course, I use Mac, I use Windows only when they are required. For some things, you need a Mac. For developing apps for iPhone, you can't really do it on a Windows laptop. I guess you can, but not really properly. So I'm totally fine with using Mac or maybe using Windows. But if you want to learn something, especially Linux, in my opinion, you should start using it as your main operating system because it will force you. So that is what my point is. Let us say you have a laptop with nothing but Linux, and that is your new experience on a totally different operating system. Now, in the beginning, you will figure out how to access the internet. You might have to struggle a bit with the right resolution that you want to set. There are so many Windows managers in Linux, window manager or desktop manager, I should say, in Linux, that you can also try. In the beginning, I recommend that you can use maybe KD. KD is really good. It is user friendly, and it will get the job done. Installing software in Linux is again not always very smooth. You have to struggle a bit, but these things are important because it will force you, it will make sure that you get your hands dirty with Linux, and you will find your own way. And you will find different applications, various open source applications that work really well on Linux. They are, of course, free of cost, but you will get a lot of exposure. When it comes to Windows, you can, of course, use Windows for doing things like working on MS Office, which in my opinion is really good. Of course, you can use similar softwares in Linux, but for few things, Windows is really good. But for majority of things, for I should say 95% of your computing needs, I believe for most people, Linux can be a really good choice. And you should be using Linux wherever possible. You should even teach your kids on how to work on Linux. But my whole point is that if you are trying to learn Linux and you really want to learn Linux for various reasons, of course, try to use Linux as your main operating system without worrying about dual boot. Just get rid of Windows on your laptop and install Linux. It might be difficult initially. You will have to struggle. You may need to also figure out what is the right flavor of Linux. Maybe you want to use Ubuntu or Fedora or so many other different flavors of Linux, but you have to figure it out yourself. And you can only learn those things when you get your hands dirty without thinking about booting into Windows. So if you have a choice of going back to Windows, you will never really force yourself to learn. If you want to force yourself to learn, don't really give yourself any option. Just get rid of Windows and install Linux. And that is what I wanted to share in this video. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and you learned something new today. Thank you very much.